Chapter 1. Cracks in the foundation. Sun beat down on the Charleston skyline, glinting off steel beams and casting long shadows across the unfinished high-rise on Calhoun Street. Mason Rivera stood on the edge of the top floor, his hard hat tipped back slightly, surveying the controlled chaos below. Workers moved like clockwork, cement mixers roared, and the air buzzed with the scent of fresh concrete and hot metal. But beneath the surface of his meticulous project, something far more dangerous was brewing. Mason's jaw clenched as he tucked a rolled-up blueprint under his arm. He looked every part, the rugged foreman, broad-shouldered, weather-worn, sharp-eyed, but he knew appearances meant little. Behind his strong frame was a man constantly calculating risk, weighed down by decisions he couldn't undo. Every invoice he signed and every supply order that came through bore the fingerprints of the Ricci family, the crime syndicate quietly using the construction site to funnel money through fake contracts and padded costs. He hadn't wanted this life, but when his younger brother Eli got into deep gambling debts, stolen goods, one close brush with prison, Mason had taken the fall, striking a deal with the devil to keep Eli's record clean. That was 3 years ago. Now, every day was a balancing act between surviving and not sinking deeper. Mason. A shout rose from below. It was Rick, his assistant foreman, waving a clipboard. City inspectors here, unscheduled. His stomach dropped. Now, he barked. Rick nodded, already looking pale. Yep, she's heading up. Mason swore under his breath and tossed the blueprint onto a nearby folding table. Surprise inspections weren't uncommon, but they never came without a whisper beforehand, not with how deep the Ricci family's influence went. If one slipped through the cracks, it meant someone on the inside was losing grip. The freight elevator clanked to a stop and opened with a groan. Out stepped a woman in a crisp navy blue blazer, steel-toe boots, and a clipboard hugged against her chest. Her auburn hair was pulled into a sleek ponytail, her expression unreadable, but sharp as a blade. Claire Monroe. He'd heard of her, relentlessly thorough, impossibly principled, and immune to charm. Great. She scanned the floor like she was already seeing through the concrete to every hidden lie. When her eyes locked onto his, Mason felt something shift, not just a flicker of attraction, though she was striking in a way that wasn't polished but purposeful, but something heavier, a sense of threat, of inevitability. Mason Rivera, she asked, voice clipped and professional. That's me, he replied, trying not to sound wary. Didn't expect anyone from the city today. She raised an eyebrow. That's the point of a surprise inspection, Mr. Rivera. He motioned toward the structure. You want the tour or the paperwork first? I want both. And I want answers for why your foundation cement batch was double the cost of last month's, despite identical specs. Of course she already knew. Mason gritted his teeth and forced a casual shrug. Must have been a vendor markup. We'll look at the invoices. Claire didn't blink. We will, together, as she walked ahead, clipboard ready. Mason watched her with a sinking feeling in his gut. He'd handled nosy inspectors before, paid off a few, intimidated others, but something told him Claire Monroe wasn't going to be easy to bend, and somewhere, deep inside, a part of him didn't want her to be. Chapter 2. Blueprints and boundaries. Claire stood at the edge of the scaffolding, wind tugging at the loose strands of hair framing her face as she flipped through the blueprints Mason had begrudgingly handed over. Her eyes darted across the pages with practiced precision, catching every misaligned number, every sudden change in supply costs. She wasn't just looking for code violations, she was hunting for dishonesty, the kind that had brought her family to its knees years ago. Mason hovered a few feet away, arms crossed tightly over his chest, watching her. She hadn't said much since they climbed to the top floor, but her silence was louder than a jacama. He hated how tense he felt under her gaze. Normally, he could smooth talk inspectors, steer the narrative, but with Claire, every attempt at charm bounced off her like rubber bullets against reinforced glass. You added a retaining wall on the north side? She asked without looking up. It was necessary. City changed zoning last month. Had to pivot. She glanced up sharply. I reviewed the zoning memo this morning. No such change. Mason clenched his jaw. She was good. Well, maybe we got ahead of the curve. Safety precaution. Her eyes narrowed. Interesting interpretation of safety. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Below them, the sounds of the site continued, machinery grinding, men shouting, a crane beeping in reverse. But up here, the tension was electric. You know, Mason said finally, stepping closer, you don't have to treat me like I'm trying to pull one over on you. We're all just trying to build something here. Claire looked up, meeting his gaze. So am I. Only I'm trying to build a city that doesn't collapse under the weight of corruption. There was steel in her voice, but something else, too. Pain, anger. He couldn't tell. Mason sighed and ran a hand down his face. I get it, really, but you've got the wrong guy. Claire closed the blueprint folder with a sharp snap. Then you won't mind if I dig deeper. She turned and began to walk the perimeter of the floor, boots crunching over gravel and dust. Mason watched her go, irritation and admiration warring inside him. Suddenly, a low rumble echoed in the distance. Dark clouds had crept in from the west, the sky shifting from blue to bruised grey in a matter of minutes. Thunder cracked, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Claire looked up, squinting. Great, just what I needed. We should get down, Mason called out. It's not safe up here during a storm. But Claire was already moving toward the opposite side, double-checking something on her notes. A gust of wind swept through, slamming a metal gate nearby, startling her. She stumbled slightly, and Mason was instantly beside her, steadying her elbow with his hand. Careful, he said, voice softer now. This place bites when you least expect it. Claire glanced at him, her expression unreadable, but she didn't pull away. They stood there for a moment, just a moment, train spattering against their shoulders, thunder rumbling above, the city below them vast and blurred. Mason saw it then, behind her tough exterior, the flicker of someone who wasn't just here to enforce rules, but to protect something she deeply believed in. Claire stepped back, brushing his hand off gently. I'll be back tomorrow, early, I figured, Mason replied. But there was a strange softness in his voice now. Try not to get struck by lightning on the way down. She shot him a look over her shoulder. You first, Rivera. And with that, she disappeared into the elevator, leaving Mason staring after her, curious, unsettled, and, for the first time in a long while, unsure of which wall would fall first. The ones he built around his secret, or the ones around her heart. Chapter 3. The sound of steel and silence. Morning sun filtered through scaffolding like gold dust, casting angular shadows across the skeletal building. Claire stepped onto the site earlier than usual, clipboard in hand, lips pressed in a firm line. Her thoughts had been restless all night. Numbers, invoices, and the way Mason had steadied her arm, still looping in her mind. She hadn't expected kindness, not from someone like him. The site was already alive with the rhythm of construction. Hammers struck metal, concrete churned, and the scent of sawdust mingled with diesel. Claire moved through it all like she belonged, eyes sharp, boots firm, ignoring the curious glances from the workers. She wasn't here to make friends, but curiosity tugged at her the moment she caught sight of Mason on the far end, crouched next to a younger man in a faded hoodie, gesturing toward a stack of supply crates. The man's face was boyish, thinner than Mason's, with nervous energy twitching in his movements. She ducked behind a beam instinctively, heart thudding. Something about the interaction felt intimate, not romantic but familiar. The way Mason laid a steadying hand on the young man's shoulder, the urgency in his voice. Even if she couldn't quite make out the words, she inched closer, the hum of the site masking her steps. I told you not to come during work hours, Mason muttered, low but firm. I had to, the young man whispered. They're asking questions, Mason, about the last drop. Mason exhaled, dragging a hand down his face. Eli, just go. Let me handle it. Eli. Claire's pen stilled mid-note. His brother. Mason glanced over his shoulder suddenly, and his eyes landed on her. Their gazes locked her stunned, his guarded. Claire straightened immediately, pretending to be reviewing the safety checklist taped to a pillar. Too late. He knew she'd seen something. By the time she turned back around, Eli was already gone, disappearing down a narrow stairwell with a hood pulled over his head. Mason strode toward her, jaw tight, steps echoing on the steel flooring. "You always sneak around corners, Inspector?" he asked, tone clipped. "I walk the site," she replied coolly. "Sometimes people forget this is a public project, not a private playground." He stopped a foot in front of her. "Whatever you think you saw, don't." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Don't what?" "Don't do my job. Or don't ask why a man who isn't licensed is wandering around an active construction zone." "That was my brother," Mason said finally. "He had no business being here, but it wasn't illegal." Claire studied him, noting the flicker of something vulnerable in his eyes, not fear, guilt. "I didn't say it was illegal," she said, voice softer now. "But your name's already under scrutiny, Mason. You know that, right?" His jaw ticked. "You mean you're the one putting it there?" "I mean this project has too many irregularities, and now I'm wondering how many of them come back to family." For a moment, something passed between them, unspoken and heavy. Mason didn't deny it. He didn't deflect. Instead, he said quietly, "He's not a bad kid. He just made mistakes. And I'm trying to make sure he doesn't drown because of them." Claire looked away. Her father's name still echoed in city records as a stain. She knew what it was like to carry someone else's mess on your back. After a long silence, she flipped her page and scribbled something down. "I'll be back tomorrow," she said, turning to leave. Mason didn't stop her this time, but as she walked away, she felt his gaze linger, not with defensiveness, but with something far more complicated, and Claire, against all better judgment, felt something stir inside her. A seed of doubt, a thread of empathy, a sense that the man she was trying to unravel might not be made entirely of concrete. After all. Chapter 4. Concrete and cafe. The late afternoon sun dipped low behind the steel skeleton of the high-rise, casting long golden streaks across the site. Mason stood alone near the site office, the day's tension etched in his shoulders as he stared at the crooked stack of invoices Claire had flagged earlier. Numbers didn't lie, but they could be twisted, padded, masked, just like everything else in his life. He had barely slept the night before. Claire Monroe was burrowing under his skin, not just because of the risk she posed, but because she really saw him and hadn't backed down. And yet, she hadn't reported him. Not yet. Across the lot, he spotted her again, clipboard clutched tight to her side, lips pursed in that determined frown that made something stupid in his chest ache. Acting on instinct, Mason called out, "Hey, Inspector." Claire turned, brows arched in mild annoyance. He walked toward her, his voice low, casual. "You got a minute? I owe you something." Claire crossed her arms. "If it's another spreadsheet, I'll pass," he smirked, the first genuine grin he'd worn all day. "Coffee." "No spreadsheets, just peace offering. Truce, maybe." She hesitated. Her every instinct said don't, but curiosity had a grip on her tighter than she wanted to admit. After a long pause, she gave a single nod. "One coffee." Then back to business. The little cafe across the street from the site smelled like roasted beans and warm bread. It was quiet, a world away from the noise and grind of the construction zone. They sat by the window, to steaming mugs between them, awkward silence stretching across the small table. Mason leaned back, watching her over the rim of his cup. "So, this is what you do after work? Hunt people down with suspicious cement orders?" Claire gave him a side glance. "Only the ones with nice arms and shady ledgers," he chuckled, surprised by the sass. "So I've got one thing going for me." Claire tried to hide her smile behind her mug. It was dangerous, this warmth between them. She wasn't here to be charmed, but the Mason sitting across from her wasn't the version she'd built in her head. This one seemed tired. "Human. Why construction?" she asked. He shrugged. "Started out hauling bricks for my uncle's company. Found out I like seeing things go from nothing to something solid. It's honest work. Well, it used to be." Claire's gaze didn't waver. "Used to be." Mason hesitated. His thumb traced the edge of the cup. "Let's just say, Life gets messy. People make deals they don't want to protect the ones they love. She studied him quietly, the line between duty and compassion thinning. That's the excuse people always use, isn't it? I did it for someone else, but the damage still lands somewhere. Yeah, Mason said, his voice barely above a whisper. Usually, on both sides, the silence that followed was different, softer, more intimate. Claire looked down, fiddling with her sleeve, and Mason watched her, wondering how a woman made of armor could make him feel so exposed. Finally, she spoke. "You're not what I expected." He raised an eyebrow. "That's a good thing." She met his gaze. "I haven't decided yet." A soft laugh escaped him, and for the first time in weeks, something inside him eased. Outside, the sky turned lavender with the last light of day. Inside the cafe, two people sat across from each other, still tangled in questions and secrets, but the edges were starting to soften bit by bit, like weathered stone smoothed by time. For now, the coffee was warm, the company surprisingly welcome, and neither of them noticed how quietly the walls around their hearts had begun to crack. Chapter 5, Safety Lines and Second Chances. Morning began like any other gritty air, echoing clangs of hammers and the steady rhythm of Charleston's ever-growing skyline. But Claire's steps were more hesitant than usual as she crossed the gravel toward the high-rise. Her thoughts still lingered on the unexpected coffee with Mason. She hadn't meant to laugh. She hadn't meant to like him. She shook the thoughts off as she adjusted her hard hat and scanned her checklist. She was here for a reason, and it wasn't to get swept up in the eyes of a charming foreman with secrets stitched into his steel beams. Mason spotted her as she neared the east wing. "Morning, Inspector," he called from where he stood, mid-conversation with a welder. Claire gave a curt nod. "Morning. Let's keep it professional today." His lips twitched in amusement. "Of course. Strictly permits and pressure loads." She rolled her eyes, but the faintest smile betrayed her. As they moved across the third floor, Claire paused to inspect a recently secured beam. It was freshly welded, still warm to the touch. "This beam's not in the original blueprint," she noted. Mason leaned against a post. "Added support. Engineer signed off yesterday." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Show me the paperwork later," he nodded, and they continued, stepping over cords and tools as the site buzzed around them. The floor trembled slightly as a crane hoisted a pallet of concrete blocks. Nearby, Claire was jotting down notes. When the sharp crack of a cable echoed through the air, everything moved too fast. Mason saw the rig above sway, then jerk violently. One of the blocks had come loose. It plummeted toward the scaffolding like dead weight. Workers shouted. Someone screamed. And then, "Move!" Mason's voice roared as he lunged. Claire barely had time to register the blur of motion before Mason's arms wrapped around her, yanking her away just as the heavy block smashed into the scaffolding behind them, sending dust and splinters into the air. They tumbled hard onto the gravel, Mason landing beneath her, his arms still locked around her protectively. Everything went still. Claire's heart pounded in her ears as she blinked up at the sky. Mason's breath was ragged beneath her, his chest rising fast. "You okay?" he asked, voice hoarse. She nodded, stunned. "Why, yeah, you." He gave a shaky laugh. "I've had worse falls." For a few seconds, neither of them moved. Claire could feel the tremor in his hands, the thudding of his heart against her palm. When she finally pushed herself up, dust clinging to her blazer, she realized the impact had rattled her far more than she let on. Mason sat up beside her, brushing gravel from his arms. His eyes searched hers with an intensity she wasn't ready for. "You didn't have to do that," she murmured. He gave her a look. "Yeah, I did." She swallowed hard. "Why?" Mason looked away for a moment, then back at her. "Because you matter." The words hit her like a second fall. Before she could respond, workers began to swarm the area, checking the damage, asking if they were okay. The spell broke. Claire stood, brushing herself off, eyes darting everywhere, but at Mason. She quickly gathered her clipboard, her voice tight. "We'll need to report this. Safety protocol." "Yeah," Mason said quietly. "I'll handle it." Claire nodded and turned to leave, but paused. She glanced back, her voice softer now. "Thank you." Mason offered a small, tired smile. "Anytime, Inspector." As she walked away, her steps felt uneven. It wasn't just the near-death experience that had her shaken. It was the way he looked at her, like she was more than a threat to his secrets, like she was someone worth saving. And deep down, Claire began to wonder if she had been wrong about Mason Rivera from the start, or if she was only now seeing the truth that had been there all along. Chapter 6. Ghosts in the Blueprint. Charleston skyline shimmered in the late afternoon heat as Claire sat alone in the unfinished stairwell, tracing her finger absent-mindedly along the faded corner of a blueprint. The city buzzed outside, horns honking, waves lapping at the harbor, the faint clang of steelwork echoing through the air. But inside the skeleton of the building, everything was still. She needed a moment. After the near accident, she couldn't quite shake the feeling of Mason's arms wrapped around her, the way he'd looked at her as if she wasn't just another obstacle on his job site but something more. But that wasn't why she was here now. Claire closed the blueprint and leaned back against the cool concrete. Her thoughts had been spiraling 4 days, fighting facts and feelings at every turn, and they always circled back to the same place. Her father. He had been a respected man once, city planner, a stickler for rules, a hero in her eyes, until the scandal, until the bribes. The moment his name hit the newspapers, Claire had stopped being his daughter and started being the girl whose father sold the city. That shame had carved itself into her like a scar. She'd promised herself then she would never look away, never let corruption slide, which made what she was feeling now about Mason all the more confusing. The sound of heavy boots on concrete drew her from her thoughts. She looked up to see Mason approaching, a grease-stained rag in one hand, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, exposing forearms dusted with grit. He paused when he saw her sitting there. "Didn't expect to find you hiding in a stairwell," he said gently. "I'm not hiding," she replied, though her voice lacked its usual edge, "just needed air." He leaned against the wall across from her, quiet for a moment before speaking. "You okay? After the other day?" Claire nodded slowly. "I'm fine." He studied her for a second longer, then sat down beside her on the same step, leaving a respectful space between them. "You know, you surprised me. You didn't run off after the fall. Most people would have used that as an excuse to shut the whole site down." Claire stared at the faint scuff marks on the concrete. "I've seen worse than falling beams." Mason tilted his head. "Want to talk about it?" She hesitated, then exhaled. "My father was a city official. Years ago, he took bribes from contractors, inflated permits, falsified inspections, things I see now and recognize. Back then, I didn't understand. I just watched everything fall apart." Mason said nothing, giving her the space to keep going. "When he was arrested, people stopped looking me in the eye. I was 15. Teachers, friends, parents, neighbors. Suddenly, I was the daughter of a criminal. It broke my mom. Broke a lot of things." "I'm sorry," Mason said softly. She glanced at him. "That's why I do this. Why I'm so strict. I have to believe the system can be clean. Because if not, then he fell for nothing. And I've built my life on a lie." Mason was quiet for a long beat before he spoke. "You ever think people make bad choices for good reasons?" Claire's eyes flicked to him. "Is that what you've done?" He didn't flinch. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm still figuring that out." They sat in silence, the past thick in the air between them. Then Mason stood and offered her his hand. "Come on. I want to show you something." Warily, Claire took it. He led her through the site until they reached the north side, where the skeleton of a community room was being framed. "This wasn't part of the original design," he said. "I added it myself. Once this building is done, that space will be open to neighborhood kids' after-school programs, art workshops, tutoring." Claire blinked. "Why?" Mason shrugged, glancing at the sky. "Because kids like my brother needed a place like this, and no one ever built one for him." She looked at him, really looked. The man who was caught between right and wrong, who saved her life, who listened without judgment, who carried ghosts just like she did. "Thank you for showing me," she said, her voice quiet. He turned to her, eyes serious. I know I'm not what you expected, Claire, but I want you to know, I'm trying. And for the first time, she believed him. Chapter 7. Walls we build. City hummed with the loathing of industry as Claire stepped into the construction site with a renewed sense of purpose. The memory of Mason's voice, I'm trying, still lingered in her chest. She wanted to believe him. She almost did. But the closer she got to him, the more afraid she was of what she might find or feel. The site felt different that morning, less chaotic, more focused. Mason was reviewing deliveries with Rick when Claire approached, her clipboard hugged tightly against her chest. I need to talk to you, she said, her voice firmer than she felt. Mason turned, surprised but calm. Morning to you too, Inspector. Claire ignored the teasing. In private, he led her toward the small site officer, makeshift space with filing cabinets, dusty blueprints, and a desk that had seen better years. The door clicked shut behind them, and the moment stretched long and tight. Claire laid a folded stack of papers on the desk. I pulled the latest budget reports from the city records, cross-checked them with the site's purchasing orders. Mason's brow furrowed, and she hesitated, then flipped the top sheet open. There's a $47,000 discrepancy. Materials ordered that don't exist. Cement from vendors who don't answer their phones. Trucks that never made it to the site. Mason's jaw tightened. Claire took a breath, steadying herself. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me this is a mistake in paperwork, a missing receipt, anything. But Mason didn't answer. He dropped his gaze to the floor, the silence pressing against them like a loaded beam. Claire's voice broke slightly. You said you were trying. I am, he said, quietly but firmly. But it's not that simple. Her fists clenched at her sides. Mason, this isn't a zoning violation. This is criminal. I'm required to report this. I'm not here to play cat and mouse with your conscience. Mason turned away from her, gripping the edge of the desk like he needed something solid to hold on to. If I could tell you everything, I would. But I can't. Not yet. Why not? She demanded. He turned back, eyes blazing with guilt and something that looked like fear. Because it's not just about me. There are people I'm trying to protect. People who don't get second chances unless I walk this tightrope. Claire took a step back. The emotion in his voice hit her harder than she expected. But she couldn't let herself be pulled under by it. You don't get to ask for my silence while you break the law, she said, her voice cracking. That's not how this works. I know, he said, softer now. But I didn't ask for your silence. I was hoping for your patience. She blinked, swallowing hard. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air dense with tension and something heartbreakingly tender. Do you even see what you're doing to me? She whispered. I can't ignore this, Mason, I won't, because the last time I looked the other way for someone I loved my whole world collapsed. At that, Mason's expression changed. A flicker of pain crossed his face, and then just like that his walls went up. Then do what you have to do, Inspector Monroe, he said, his voice distant. I won't stop you. Claire stared at him, the space between them growing colder by the second. Her heart felt like it had been poured into a foundation and left to harden heavy. And UNMOVING. She turned without another word and left the office, her steps echoing like footsteps in an empty room. And behind her, Mason stood perfectly still, surrounded by walls of his own making, walls even he didn't know how to tear down. Chapter 8. Rain on Rebarth. Storm rolled in without warning. Thunder cracked across the Charleston sky as rain began to fall in sheets, drenching the half-built structure in minutes. Workers scrambled for shelter, covering tools and locking down materials, their shouts swallowed by the howl of wind. Claire tightened her coat around her and ducked beneath the overhang near the freight elevator. She hadn't meant to come to the site that late. She was supposed to file her report, walk away, wash her hands of it all. But someone kept her coming back. Lightning lit up the sky, casting stark shadows through the unfinished beams. She turned to leave only to find Mason stepping out of the elevator, equally soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead, and his shirt clinging to his frame. They both froze, Seriously? Claire asked over the wind. What are you doing here? I could ask you the same, Mason replied, tugging the elevator gate shut behind him. Came back to check the east scaffolding. It wasn't secured before the crew left, Claire sighed, brushing raindrops from her face. I was reviewing one last panel. Thought I'd be out in 5 minutes. Then this started. He looked past her, toward the edge of the site where the rainwater was pooling fast. You can't leave in this. The streets'll flood before you hit your car. She hesitated. So what do we do? Mason nodded toward the site office. Come on, at least we won't drown in there. Claire hesitated again, then followed him through the storm. The rain soaked them both to the skin before they reached the trailer. Inside, the warmth hit like a wave. Stale coffee and dry plywood never smelled so welcoming. Mason flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. Generators down, he muttered. Figures. Claire pulled off her soaked blazer, tossing it over the back of a chair. Of course. Perfect night. He opened a drawer, pulling out a slightly dented travel mugs and an old thermos. I keep emergency coffee around. Want some? She eyed the thermos. If it's from this decade, sure. He chuckled and poured them both a mug. They sat in silence for a while, the trailer lit only by the faint glow of lightning outside and the occasional glimmer from distant streetlights. The rain drummed hard on the metal roof, steady and rhythmic. Claire sipped the bitter coffee, watching Mason over the rim of her mug. You always this calm in a storm. Been through worse, he said. Storms are easy. They pass. She gave a small, humorless laugh. If only everything did. Mason leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. Look, about the other day what you said in the office. You were right. I'm walking a line I shouldn't be, and I've done things I'm not proud of. But I'm not trying to hurt anyone. Claire, especially not you. Her heart beat faster at the sound of her name in his voice. Soft, unarmored. I don't know what to do with you, she whispered. I'm supposed to stop people like you, and yet, every time I come here, I want to understand you instead. Mason looked up, eyes searching hers. Maybe because deep down, you know I'm not the villain in your story. Claire held his gaze for a long, aching moment. The storm howled around them, but in that cramped, dim trailer, time slowed. She didn't move when he reached across the table, his hand brushing against hers, tentative, careful. Her fingers curled around his, as if her heart had already decided what her mind couldn't. The warmth between them, fragile and flickering, settled like a whisper in the silence. Neither of them spoke again. They didn't need to. Chapter 9. Brick by brick, sky over Charleston had cleared, leaving puddles scattered across the gravel like forgotten footprints of the storm. The construction site buzzed back to life, but something between Mason and Claire had shifted, subtle, unspoken, but undeniable. Mason hadn't slept much since that night in the trailer. Claire's hand in his, her eyes soft in the candlelit dark. It haunted him, not in a painful way, but in the way something beautiful does when you know you don't deserve it. He stood now in the site's makeshift office. Documents spread across the desk, real invoices, receipts, scanned copies of supply manifests. Every page was evidence, and every page was a risk. Mason had started documenting the trail, quietly, carefully, every dollar that didn't belong, every name connected to the Ricci family's laundering web. If he was going down, he was dragging the truth with him. But more than that, he was building an escape. One brick at a time, he flipped through a set of invoices, pausing at the signature he'd forged last month. His stomach turned. It was all coming to a head, and he knew the moment Claire found out what he was doing behind the scenes, she'd either run or stay. A knock on the door snapped him out of his thoughts. Claire stepped inside, tucking a loose curl behind her ear. She didn't carry her clipboard today, just a worn leather notebook. Didn't expect you so early, Mason said. I needed to see the South Column report, she replied. But there was hesitation in her voice, and I wanted to talk. Mason straightened, hiding the paperwork under a spare set of blueprints. Sure, what's on your mind? Claire stepped closer, brows furrowed. I've been going over everything again. The budgets, the supplier shifts, even the crew assignments, and I know something's off. But I also know you've been trying to fix it, quietly. Mason's heart stalled. You're not just playing both sides anymore, she continued. You're trying to clean up a mess that wasn't all yours to begin with. I see it, Mason. He met her eyes, surprise and a strange kind of hope flickering there. I didn't want to drag you into it. Claire crossed her arms, stepping even closer. You didn't. I walked in with my eyes open. A long silence stretched between them. Mason looked down. I'm scared, Claire. Not of getting caught. I can handle that. I'm scared of you looking at me one day and seeing only the worst part of me. She softened. I already did. And I'm still here. He reached for her hand. Slowly this time, like he needed her permission. She didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined, quiet and sure. I'm going to fix this, Mason said. I don't know how yet, but I will. Claire nodded. Then let me help. He blinked. You want to help me? I want to see this through, she said gently. Not just for the project. For you, outside. The sounds of the site carried on, trucks reversing, steel groaning, but inside that office, time felt still again. Just like the stormy night. And for the first time in years, Mason felt like he wasn't rebuilding alone. Chapter 10. The inspection. Claire stood in front of the high-rise, clipboard in hand, her heart beating with a steady, uneasy rhythm. The morning sun glared off the steel beams, and the site looked immaculate to immaculate. Every corner swept, every sign properly hung, every worker on edge with the knowledge that today wasn't just any inspection. It was her inspection, the final one. And Mason knew it. She spotted him across the site, speaking to Rick and nodding toward the southeast stairwell. Their eyes met briefly. Mason gave a small nod, almost respectful, almost grateful, and then turned away. Claire swallowed hard and got to work. She moved methodically, checking scaffolding supports, running her hand along the freshly dried rebar, cross-referencing supply counts. Everything, on paper, looked perfect, but paper could lie. She moved to the lower level, where they stored archived delivery logs. The door was locked, a minor, but unusual inconvenience. Claire frowned, pulled a pin from her bun, and jimmied the latch open with a flick. Inside, it was dark and musty, the air filled with dust and forgotten blueprints. She stepped over a stack of insulation and knelt beside an unmarked file box. Invoices, shipping manifests, most of them routine, until one caught her eye. It was dated 3 months prior, before she'd started inspections. A bulk order of copper piping, from a vendor that didn't exist. She checked the signature, Mason's name. Her heart dropped. She sat back on her heels, the paper trembling slightly in her hand. Part of her had already suspected this, known it in her bones, but seeing it in ink twisted something inside her. Had he really changed? Was he still tangled up in it? She returned to the main floor, her steps heavy. Mason saw her coming, saw the look on her face, and his posture shifted. Claire, he asked, voice calm but cautious. She held up the invoice. This, she said. This is you, isn't it? Mason didn't look at the paper. He didn't deny it. Yes. The word landed like a gavel in her chest. Why? She whispered. After everything you said, after everything I signed that, Mason said quietly. But it was before I started pulling out, before I realized I couldn't keep justifying it. Claire took a step back. So it's true. You did launder money. I did, he said. But I'm not doing it anymore. I've been documenting everything. Quietly. I didn't want you to get caught in it. Her eyes filled, but she refused to let the tears fall. You should have trusted me. We could have. I couldn't risk dragging you down, he said, stepping closer. You're the one good thing in my life that isn't tainted. Claire shook her head. You don't get to decide how I'm involved. Mason, you lied. He went still. I didn't lie. I held on to the truth for too long. She looked at him, this man who'd saved her, who'd let her in, who had been slowly rebuilding not just the site, but himself, and she walked away, not with anger, but with devastation, because love wasn't enough if the foundation was still cracked. Chapter 11. Fault line's sun barely filtered through the dense clouds hanging over Charleston as Claire stood by the waterfront, her breath coming in shallow waves. She'd walked 4 hours, tracing the same streets she used to wander as a child when the city still felt safe. Before scandal had taught her that even the most beautiful things could crumble, Mason's confession echoed in her mind, sharp and steady like a ticking clock. I did, but I'm not doing it anymore. She wanted to believe him. God. She wanted to. But the truth sat between them now like a fault line deep, unmoving, waiting to fracture everything in its path. Later that day, Mason waited alone in the site trailer. The stack of documents he'd been collecting spread out in front of him, and battlefield names, dates, wire transfers, falsified shipping logs, all of it ready. He had nothing left to hide, only one thing left to lose. The trailer door creaked open, and Claire stepped in. Her hair was damp from the sea air, and her eyes, usually sharp with determination, were weary. He stood, but didn't move toward her. I didn't expect you to come back, he said quietly. I almost didn't, she replied. A long silence stretched between them. I meant what I said, Mason continued. Everything I did was to protect my brother. I got into deep, and by the time I realized what I'd become, I couldn't see a way out without bringing him down with me. Claire's voice was low. You could have told me the truth. I was scared, not of being arrested, of you walking away. His throat tightened. You were the first person to see me as more than what I've done. Claire's fingers curled around the edge of a chair. And yet you still kept me in the dark. I thought I was protecting you. No, she whispered. You were deciding for me, just like my father did. He said the same thing, that he was shielding me from the truth. But all it did was tear our family apart. Mason closed his eyes. I'm not your father, Claire, but you made me feel like that same scared girl again. Like I couldn't trust the ground beneath my feet. He stepped closer. The tension between them taut as wire. I don't want to be the reason you lose faith again. That's why I'm going to the authorities today. Claire's eyes widened. Mason, I'm turning over everything, testifying. No more running, no more hiding behind blueprints and steel. He handed her a flash drive. This has everything. If I get buried in the process, I need someone I trust to make sure the truth comes out. Her hand trembled as she took it. Are you sure? She asked. He nodded, a sad smile on his face. I've built a lot of things in my life, but this is the first step in tearing down what's rotten so something better can rise. Claire looked at him, truly looked, not as the man who had broken her trust, but the man who was willing to break himself to make it right. I don't know what happens next, she said softly. Neither do I, he replied. But for once, I'm not afraid of it. She turned to leave, her steps slow, her heart heavier than ever. Mason watched the door close behind her, knowing that what he'd just done cost him everything. But maybe, just maybe, it would also be the one thing that finally set them both free. Chapter 12. Demolition. The courthouse steps loomed before Mason like the edge of a cliff. He stood there alone, dressed in a plain grey button-down, the collar slightly wrinkled, his palms damp despite the cool morning air. The documents he'd submitted had triggered a storm of subpoenas, frozen accounts, and hushed whispers across Charleston's underbelly. The Ricci family's grip on the city's construction contracts had been tighter than anyone had dared admit until now. He'd spent the night before in silence, walking through the half-finished halls of the high-rise, fingers brushing against cold concrete, as if saying goodbye to something that had never really belonged to him. Inside the courtroom, fluorescent lights buzzed above as Mason gave his testimony, deliberate, unwavering, full of names and numbers that would collapse an empire of hidden crime. His voice never faltered, but his eyes carried the weight of a man laying bricks over his own past, sealing it behind him one admission at a time. When it was done, the judge ordered a temporary hold on construction. Permits were frozen, contracts suspended. The company Mason had worked so hard to legitimize crumbled in real time. Headlines the next morning painted a bleak picture. Corruption scandal rocks Charleston construction industry. Foreman turns witness in Ricci family money laundering case. Local hero or criminal. Mason Rivera breaks his silence. Claire sat in the city planner's office, watching the news unfold on a muted TV screen. Her reassignment had come swiftly promoted, ironically, for her integrity and follow-through. But it felt hollow, empty, because the one man who had made her believe in second chances might never get his own. The last time she saw Mason, his eyes had been calm, not desperate, not afraid, just resolved, and she hated how much she missed him. She stared out the office window at the Charleston skyline, wondering how something so beautiful could be built on so much brokenness. Later that afternoon, she returned to the site not as an inspector, but as a woman chasing memories. It was eerily quiet now, equipment locked, tools abandoned. The wind rustled through loose plastic tarps, making the half-finished building sound like it was breathing its last. She walked past the trailer, past the half-board community room Mason had once shown her. She stopped there, letting her fingers drift across the framework. The bones of something good were still here. She closed her eyes, remembering his voice. "I've built a lot of things in my life, but this is the first step in tearing down what's rotten so something better can rise." The demolition had begun, not just of buildings or companies, but of lies, secrets, the versions of themselves that could no longer stand. Claire placed her hand on the nearest beam and whispered, "You did the right thing." She didn't know where Mason was now, but in the quiet, she hoped he could somehow hear her. Chapter 13. Letters in the dust. Claire returned home late that evening, the weight of the day pressed into her shoulders like concrete slabs. She hadn't slept properly in days, her nights filled with silence and the ghost of Mason's voice repeating in her mind. She didn't expect anything to be waiting for her when she walked into her apartment. No calls, no updates, just the usual echo of her own footsteps. But there it was, an envelope, unmarked, hand-delivered, resting quietly atop her kitchen table. It had always belonged there. Her breath caught as she unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The handwriting was unmistakable, firm, slanted, familiar. Mason's. "Claire, I don't know if this will find you before the dust settles, but I needed to leave something behind. Something real, something honest. There are 100 things I should apologize for. What I did, what I didn't say, the way I let silence become the wall between us. You saw parts of me I had buried so deep, I forgot they were even there, and you made me want to be better, not to impress you, but because you looked at me like I already could be. I never thought I'd meet someone who challenged me like you did, who refused to flinch, even when I gave you every reason to. You never looked away, Claire. You stared my shame in the face and still gave me the gift of your truth. I'm not proud of how it all started, but I'm proud of what it became, of what we became, if only for a moment. I don't know what comes next. Maybe I'll never get back to the life I lost. Maybe I don't deserve to. But if I ever do get the chance to start again, I hope it's in a place where your laugh echoes through steel frames, where your boots leave prints in fresh concrete, where your name doesn't feel like guilt, but like hope. Thank you for seeing me." Mason. Claire sat down slowly, the letter trembling in her hands. Her fingers brushed the last line again and again, tracing the words like they were carved into something sacred. "You saw parts of me I had buried so deep." She closed her eyes, tears sliding down her cheeks, not in sorrow but in release. Because Mason hadn't disappeared. He hadn't left without a word. He had left a piece of himself, right there in her hands, raw, vulnerable, real. And for the first time since the site had gone quiet, Claire let herself believe that broken things could be rebuilt, even hearts. Chapter 14. Rebuilding. Capit's spring air in Charleston carried the scent of new beginnings, salt from the harbor, earth from rain-washed sidewalks, and the faint sweetness of blooming magnolias. Claire stepped out of her car and looked up at the modest two-story structure going up at the edge of a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't a high-rise, it wasn't steel and glass, but it was solid, honest. And he was there. Mason stood by the framing of the front porch, a tool belt slung low on his hips, sleeves rolled to his elbows, sawdust clinging to his skin. He looked leaner, more tired, but there was peace in his posture, something grounded, something earned. Claire's footsteps were slow but certain as she approached. Her heart raced, but she didn't falter. He turned when he sensed her behind him. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them faded, just birdsong and the hum of a drill in the distance. Then Mason smiled, not the half-smirk he used to wear like armor, but something gentler, warmer, a smile built not from charm, but from gratitude. "I heard you were out here," Claire said, voice soft. "Yeah," he replied, wiping his hands on a rag. "Non-profit picked me up. Building affordable homes for displaced families. Doesn't pay much, but the walls don't lie anymore." She nodded, her chest tightening. "It suits you. I miss this," he admitted. "Working with my hands. Creating something that matters." He paused. "Missed you, too." Claire didn't answer right away. She glanced at the porch's framework. "You added a ramp instead of stairs," he shrugged. "There's a single mom on the list with a kid in a wheelchair. Figured it's time we built for everyone." Claire's lips curved, but her eyes stayed on the structure. "You changed." "I had to," Mason said. "Lying takes a toll. You start forgetting what's real." He met her gaze again. "But that letter I wrote you, that was the truest thing I've ever done." Claire stepped closer. The space between them small now, just a few inches, a few beats of a heart. "I never stopped believing in you," she said. "Even when I was furious. Even when I walked away. I just couldn't stay until you believed in yourself." Mason swallowed hard, emotion flickering in his eyes. "I do now. Not perfectly, but enough to want to try again. If you'll let me." Claire looked up at him, the breeze tugging at her coat, sunlight glinting in her eyes. "I didn't come here to inspect your site," she whispered. "I came because I missed the sound of your voice." A quiet laugh escaped him, raw and full of relief. "I can give you that," he said. "And coffee. And concrete that's finally clean." She reached out, slipping her fingers into his calloused hand. "Then let's build something better this time, brick by brick." And in that unfinished home, surrounded by dust and hope, Mason Rivera and Claire Monroe began laying the quiet foundation of something new. Together. Chapter 15. A new foundation. A soft breeze swept through the Charleston neighborhood, rustling the budding trees and carrying the scent of sawdust and spring rain. The house was nearly finished now, bright siding gleaming in the sun, windows framed with fresh white trim, and a porch that wrapped gently around the front like a long-awaited embrace. Claire stood at the bottom of the porch steps, surveying the scene with a quiet smile. Her boots crunched lightly on the gravel, a clipboard in one hand, a thermos of coffee in the other. But there was no checklist today, no stern expression, just warmth. Mason was on the roof, adjusting a small solar panel with careful precision. He noticed her right away, he always did, and climbed down the ladder with the easy grace of someone who had found solid footing again. "You're early," he said, brushing sawdust from his arms. "I like seeing things before the world rushes in," she replied, handing him the thermos. "And I wanted to see the final walkthrough." He took the coffee and gave her a slow, grateful nod. "You think it'll pass?" She raised a brow. "Well, the inspector assigned to this case is known for being impossibly tough." Mason chuckled. "That's so." Claire stepped onto the porch beside him. "But she's got a soft spot for houses built on second chances." He looked at her, then really looked, and the moment lingered like the last ray of sunset on water. Everything about this place, about them, felt like redemption. Not flashy, not loud, just quietly, beautifully earned. Inside, sunlight streamed through the wide windows, dancing across polished wood floors and open beams. Claire walked through the space, her fingers grazing the walls. There were no cracks, no shortcuts, just craftsmanship. Care. She paused in the kitchen, where Mason joined her. "You built this whole place," she said softly. "Not alone," he replied. Claire turned to face him, her voice steadier now. "You once said you were afraid I'd see the worst in you." "I remember," he said. "But you stayed." She nodded, reaching for his hand. "Because what I see now is a man who took broken things and made something good out of them." They stood there, fingers entwined, the sound of the wind rustling through open windows, the faint laughter of children playing down the street, life quietly unfolding. Claire rested her head against his shoulder. "So, What do we build next? Mason smiled into her hair. Whatever we want. And with that, the two of them stepped out onto the porch where a swing waited, where laughter would one day echo, where love had been laid carefully into the very bones of the house, because this was no longer just a project. This was their new foundation, and it would stand.